So y'all recognize that Old Testament passage my man Brian read so well. You probably remember that it's a passage that's often referred to as the source of original sin, so-called. But did you notice in that passage the word sin does not appear one single time? In fact, the word sin, this is the second chapter of Genesis. The word sin doesn't appear in the first 3 chapters of the book of Genesis. The word sin shows up for the first time in the story of Cain and Abel. The word sin does not show up in the Garden of Eden. I want to offer another take that is other than original sin on this text. The thing that strikes me right now about this text is that I think Eve often gets a bad rap. Oh, I do. We're always quick to blame Eve, but I think Eve gets a bad rap. I've never heard anyone give Eve credit for anything, frankly, but I'm studying it this week and I thought, I've never heard anyone give Eve credit for saying no to the serpent. But she did. Check this out. God said to Adam and to Eve, you can eat from every tree in the garden, except one. Now, every tree in the garden except one, y'all, that's an awful lot of freedom. That's an extraordinary generosity on God's part. Every tree but one, that's what God said. And then the serpent comes along, and the text says the craftiest cat in the whole creation. The serpent comes along and says to Eve, check this out. Hey, Eve, didn't God tell y'all couldn't eat from any of the trees in the garden? And Eve said, no. Actually, that is not what God said. God did not say we can't eat from any of the trees in the garden. God told us we could eat the fruit of any tree in the garden. That's very different, isn't it? Except for one. God said to us, not everything is for you. Now, there's an awful lot that's for you, but not everything is for you. God said there's a tree in the middle of the garden, and if you touch it, if you eat it, you'll die. That's what God said to us. Eve said to the serpent. So Eve corrected the serpent. She said, no. I never heard her getting credit for that. Now the serpent, you know what he's doing. He's trying to misrepresent God. Eve says, no, that's not what he said. So the serpent changes course and says, oh, my bad. Well, anyway, you won't die if you eat from that tree. I know that much. And on this count, the serpent is correct. Adam and Eve, this is important, y'all. Adam and Eve do not die. Now, God clearly says in the text that they would die if they ate from the tree, and they definitely did not die. In fact, God made them clothes. Y'all remember that part of the story? Come on, Sandy, that's the sweetest part of that story. God made them clothes and then went with them when they were forced from the garden. So they suffered the consequences of their actions. Now, some people are going to be offended by what I'm about to say. They suffered the consequences of their actions, yes. But God seems to have changed God's mind for love, because they did not die. And if you think about it, that really makes a lot of sense. Any parents in the room? Are there any people who have parents in the room? Is anybody in the room, check this out. So is there anybody in the room whose parents killed them? Are there any dead people in this room? Come on, Sandy, this makes a lot of sense. Like any parent, God cannot bring himself to destroy that which he has created. I don't know about original sin, but that's original love. Now I know some people say, oh, here he goes again. And some people, probably not y'all, maybe y'all, I'm open to it. Some people might bring me other stories from the Bible where God does destroy parts of creation. Come on, Hendree, look at this. This is where he's really violent. He really brings down the hammer, and I will concede the point. I'll concede the point. And I'll concede it peacefully. You know why? Because I'm at home. Come on, Charlie, I'm at home in this original story of God's original unconditional love. And I can live with the tension. Do you know what I mean by that? I can live with the tension. And some will say, oh, come on, Hendree, that's cheap. You're picking and choosing the parts of the Bible that you like. And I will reply, sure I can. That's exactly what I can do. They say, you can't do that. You can't pick parts of the Bible you like and leave the rest. And I say, why not? Jesus did. And they'll look at me funny. And they'll say, what? And I'll say, yeah. Jesus was very selective. My man was super selective with the scripture that he quoted. Y'all remember the book of Leviticus? Heck, I hope you don't remember it, to be honest with you. Out of the long, tedious Old Testament book of Leviticus, Jesus picked one line that he liked. Now, if you don't know Leviticus, I love Leviticus, so I love all the Bible. But Leviticus, if you know, it's pretty tough. Leviticus is full of hundreds of hardcore rules, one after the other after the other. I mean, by the time you finish with Leviticus, you better just curl up on the floor and do nothing for the rest of your life. Jesus picked one rule out of there. You know which one it was? Love your neighbor. Thank you, Lil. Love your neighbor as yourself. Like a surgeon, my man reached into that dense text and cut out the one line, pulled it out. Then he was bold to call that one line he pulled out the second great commandment. Did you know that Jesus never quoted the ultra-violent book of Joshua? My man quoted Isaiah. A challenging text. My man quoted Isaiah, the prophet who calls the people to love and acts of mercy and justice, service and peace. Where am I going with this? The basic teaching of the forbidden fruit is darn near, in my estimation, common sense. One, God ain't going to destroy that which God has created. Like any parent, He's not going to destroy the love of His own heart. Two, not everything's for you. In some circles, we just call that grown-up behavior. Not everything's for you. And if you take and eat things, then this gets me excited. If you take and eat things that are not for you, you're going to get sick. Jesus didn't focus on violent, retributive passages of the Bible because He was focused on love. And love is a diet that leads a body to acts of kindness, mercy, forgiveness, peace. Not everything is for you. God said you can eat from any tree in this garden but one. Not everything is for you. And well on into my 5th decade on this marvelous rock we call home, planet Earth, I have this sense. I wonder what your sense is. A lot of life, y'all, is deciding what's mine to get into and deciding what's mine to leave alone. Like, that's not my issue. And again, we can eat from any tree in the garden, but there's a bunch of them that we should stay away from. And it's perfectly fine to pick and to choose. Why? Why is it fine to do that? Because life is short. And we're here to love, not argue. God didn't create us, put us in the garden and say, now, argue it out. And I'm not saying anything goes. Huh? Ask my teenage daughters. Dad is not saying anything goes. I'm not saying anything goes. We don't believe that. That's foolishness. I'm not talking about ignoring problems. I'm not talking about indifference or apathy or wearing some kind of rose-colored glasses all the time. I'm talking about you can eat from every tree, but not everything's for you. This is illustrated, I'll end on this. This is illustrated in this story from the first church that I served. Served a church down in North Georgia. Never forgotten this day. I was 28 years old. I'd been a priest for 5 minutes. I mean, I was birth wet, baby. I was just brand new. I was in the office excited about being a priest and having a place to go to, a church to go to. I was in the office one day talking with a woman who was a member of the parish. Her name was Alicia. And she was volunteering in our food pantry. And I was standing as she was working in the food pantry next to her, and we were talking. And in the middle of our conversation, another woman, a parishioner named Judy, burst into the office space like a strong wind. Like I think the door actually blew open when she came in. Judy was a woman I knew reasonably well. She was always fired up. I mean, always fired up about something, and was particularly fired up that day. She burst in and she interrupted my conversation with Alicia in a really animated way, describing an issue that she was really mad and upset about. And to be totally honest, this is more than 20 years ago, I don't remember what the issue was, but I remember that she got me to bite. Very quickly, I was gathered up in her storminess. I was fired up. I was mad as hell with her. I was ready to go on the warpath, like, give me a sword and a bullhorn. Let's go. Judy turned to Alicia. She's working in the food pantry. And she said, "What about you?" And Alicia turned, and she looked at her. And Alicia always was quiet and calm. But I thought, wow, she's particularly so in this moment, in the face of Judy's storminess. And after a beat, just a little bit of silence, with great kindness and sincere warmth, Alicia said to Judy, "Oh, Judy, that's not my issue." And she smiled. And then she turned and she disappeared into our food pantry, where she started putting food into bags for hungry people who would soon arrive from our very neighborhood to be fed. And Judy stammered through a few undiscernible words, and then she turned and left. And I remember I didn't go with her. I just stood there. And I thought to myself, that's not my issue. You can say that? Like not everything is for me. I don't have to get on every train that comes through the station. And Alicia wasn't cross. She wasn't cynical. She wasn't negative. She wasn't indifferent. This woman, she doesn't have a mean bone in her body. She's a passionate follower of Jesus who simply has a sense of what's hers to do and what's not hers. I asked about Alicia later. I was so curious. I asked some of the other members of the parish. I said, well, how is she? Who is she? What? How does she do that? And this is what they told me. They said, "Oh, Hendree, a few years back, Alicia, well, she nearly died. Got really sick, right up to the edge. We all thought she was going to die. In those days, she had 2 little bitty children and a doting husband. And she almost left all of that behind. But she lived. She lived and she learned, they said to me. So Alicia learned firsthand just how fragile life is. And so they said to me, she knows what matters and what's not hers. See, there are things that are for you. There are things that are for me. There are things that are for us. But there are also things that are not for us. And the temptation stories of our tradition are not trying to give us pat answers. They're an invitation to wrestle with the question, what's mine to do? And when we find the answer to that question, then we ought to do that thing or those things with all our hearts. And here it is. And we ought not worry so much about the rest. Because life is short, and we're here to love. Not everything's for you, but something is. I wonder what? Amen.